It is a privilege to be here with you today, Dr. Tatum, and I'm going to call you Dr. Bev because we go back so far. And it is just a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you a little bit today. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And please do call me Dr. Bev. I look forward to this conversation. It's great to be with you.
Well, listen, there is so much going on in the world today, and you wear so many hats. When I met you, you were the president of Spelman, and so you are president emerita now, but spent 13 years growing and innovating at one of our finest historically Black colleges and universities. But you also wear the hat of author, mother, wife. You have so many dimensions to your personality. So I know that what's going on in the world today is both relevant and resonant, particularly around race and racism, where you have spent a lot of time during your professional career writing about it. And frankly, as an African American woman living through some of the issues that we have faced in the past and bring it forward. Here we are again in the 21st century. Can you tell us what has changed or what have you seen change over the last 20 years? You wrote your book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria, in 1997, and you wrote an update in 2017. So almost a generation difference. What has changed, do you think, in that time period?
Happy to talk about that. And in fact, it was because I saw a change, a generational difference, while I was
Mm.
at Spelman as president, that when I retired from that role in 2015, I agreed with my publisher to spend the next 2 years updating that book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, so that we would have a current, up to date 20th anniversary edition in the fall of 2017. And the prologue that I put in the new edition of the book really is focused on that 20-year period. And I like to describe the four areas that I talk about in the book as the four P's, things that have changed in this last 20 years. The first P is population. We know there's been a demographic shift. We can go back further than 20 years, certainly to see the magnitude of it. In fact, sometimes I like to use my own birth date, 1954, as a marker. In 1954, the population of the United States was 90% white, 10% everybody else. That means 10% Black, Latino, Asian American, Indigenous, all combined. If we
Right.
fast forward to the 21st century, to young people who were born maybe in 1997 or even in 2000, they're being born into a generation, a cohort of young people that is approximately 50% white and 50% everyone else. That's a big shift. And that population shift is part of what is driving, I think, some of the political activity that we see, some of the anxiety about change in America. One of the things that I will say about that first P, population, is that even though there's been a shift in the demographics, the shift in where people live and how they interact has not followed in quite the same way. So today, our public education is still very segregated. Our neighborhoods are quite segregated. So it is still the case that 75% of white adults, according to a national survey, have a social network that is entirely white. So while the population has gotten more diverse, who people are interacting with has not necessarily shifted. And that's part of the dynamic when we think about race relations in the United States. Another P is politics. As I
Right.
said, the population shift is driving some of the political rhetoric that we hear. But when I was thinking about politics, I was really thinking about political leadership because we've had four presidents during that time span. When my book first came out in 1997, Bill Clinton was the president. And in 1997, he launched what he called his President's Initiative on Race. He made a speech in Akron, Ohio. I happened to be honored to be present when he made this speech. And he talked about why that year, 1997, was a good year to launch this initiative. He said it was because our economy was good, we were experiencing prosperity as a nation, and we were also at peace. And he said, when you're at peace and when you've got prosperity, that's when you have the energy to take on a tough topic like the legacy of racism in our society. Unfortunately, that initiative, that White House initiative that he launched, didn't get a lot of attention, a lot of traction, because not long after that, he was having his own political difficulties because of the Lewinsky scandal. But it speaks to the fact that he was ready to launch that conversation. Fast forward to the next president, George W. Bush was elected in 2000, and in 2001, barely a year, not even a year into his presidency, 9/11 happened. And then we weren't a nation at peace. Now we're a nation perceiving ourselves as under threat. And
Mm.
also during his tenure in 2008, the collapse of the economy, the Great Recession happened just at the end of President Bush's tenure. A little later that fall, President Barack Obama was elected. And what happened then was the national narrative shifted. We'd elected our first African American president. Many people were declaring racism as a thing of the past, that now we were a quote post racial society. We know that that, in fact, is not the case. And there were many things that happened during his tenure that reminded us that racism was still a problem, whether that was the killing of Trayvon Martin or Ferguson or the shooting that took place in a Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. So many examples of racial violence being expressed during his tenure. 2016, of course, brought us to the presidential election. Hillary Clinton running against Donald Trump. We know, of course, that Donald Trump became the next president, but that election period was characterized by a lot of racial rhetoric as well. Black Lives Matter was coming to the fore. Donald Trump announced his candidacy with statements that many would describe as racist about Mexican immigrants and others. So we know that racial language has been a, an important part of the political landscape over the last 4 years and continues to be even now in this election season. Which brings me to the third P, which is polarization. Most people would agree that we have never been as polarized as a nation than we are right now. And that is reflected in polls and attitudes that have been documented over the last several years. It just continues to grow, in part perhaps because of the role social media plays. We have an opportunity to get our news from very specific locations. We're not all watching the same programs every night. And so there's a range of ideas that are being circulated, and that contributes to polarization. And then the fourth P that I think was important to talk about in my book is psychology. Psychology as a field has changed. More attention has been paid to ideas that we now hear about a lot, but were relatively new concepts in the early 21st century. Unconscious bias, for example, microaggressions, stereotype threat. These are ideas that psychologists talk about that help us understand how racism is operating in our society. But again, new ideas that weren't being talked about in 1997 when I wrote my book the first time.
Wow, the four P's. I love that framework. Can you talk a little bit more about the psychology piece? You are a trained clinical psychologist, but professionally, you have been an educator and helped to enlighten students at several colleges, Spelman being the most recent. And I know you continue to be a thought leader and an author. So could you unpack the psychology bit, a piece of it a little bit more, the unconscious bias, the microaggressions, and help us understand how those theories and how those concepts have really manifested themselves in the context of today's environment?
Sure. One of the things that I think it's important to acknowledge right at the very beginning is that we all have been exposed to stereotypes, to misinformation about people different from ourselves. That's just part of our socialization experience. Sometimes I talk about the pervasiveness of um, ideas, stereotypical ideas about other groups. and not always about other groups, sometimes about our own group, right? We are exposed to these stereotypes in the form of the TV we watch, the books we read, the jokes we hear people tell, the comments we hear people make, really starting from birth. That socialization starts very, very early, and it's part of all of our experiences. It doesn't really matter whether you've grown up in a African American family, as I did, or a white family, or an Asian American family, or Latinx. Being part of the wider society exposes you to these ideas. I sometimes describe it, as I do in my book, as like smog in the air. We are all breathing smog, and that smog gets into our system and it influences how we perceive other people. So when we talk about unconscious bias, what we're really talking about are the ideas that we've internalized, perhaps without even our conscious awareness, but that influence how we engage with other people. It influences who we seek to help. It influences how we evaluate a resume. It influences who gets what kind of treatment in the hospital. It influences how you interact with someone if you're a police officer looking at cars whizzing by. It influences all kinds of interactions. And yet, sometimes we're not even aware that we are being influenced by those early socializations. One of the things I like to say is that if you breathe in a lot of smog, you're going to breathe some out. No one says, hey, I'm a smog breather. Most of us say, no, I don't have prejudices. No, I don't have biases. But if you've been exposed to these ideas, they become part of your thinking without your even being consciously aware. So we have to be aware that what we don't recognize within ourselves still can influence how we interact with other people.
Makes a whole lot of sense. It's often hard, though, to look in the mirror at yourself and recognize you have implicit bias, right? Based on the exposures and the experiences that you have. So, thank you for your leadership in this space. You talked about the presidents who were in office during the time frame from when you wrote your first book to today, and there have been four of them. And your leadership at Spelman was recognized by the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award in 2013. So your visionary steps there were third party elevated, right? And we love that. Leadership today seems to be struggling, not only in academic circles, but in business and social circles as well. I've heard you talk about the ABCs of inclusive leadership, which kind of ties to this notion of being exposed to others and welcoming them into the circle. Can you unpack that for us a little bit and explain the ABCs and how we can apply them in our lives?
Absolutely. So leadership does matter. And one of the things that I think is really critical for all of us to understand is whether you have a title that indicates you're the leader or whether you are someone who is just leading by example among your friends, your family members, your colleagues. What we do influences others. So we can all think about the ABCs of inclusive leadership. And the A stands for affirming identity. What does that mean? It means we all want to be seen, heard, and understood. And if there are aspects of my identity that are important to me, I want those aspects of my identity to be recognized. I want to be included. So if one part of my identity, of course, is being African American, being a woman, uh, both of those identities are important to me. When I enter a space, I'm going to be looking to see, are there people like me in that room? Are there other Black women in this space? Are there other Black women performing the work that I hope to be doing? What are the role models available to me? This is especially important, I think, for young people to be able to see themselves reflected in school curricula, to be able to see themselves reflected in their institutions. But whether you are 15 or 55, you want to feel included. So I think to affirm identity, what we have to start by asking is who is in the room? Who's in the picture? Sometimes I use the analogy of asking people to imagine a photo being taken, a group photo. Imagine you're gathered with a group of people and there's going to be a group photo taken, and you get a copy of the photo after it's been shot. The first thing anyone will do when they get their copy of the photo is look for themselves in it. But if for some reason they'd been digitally removed, if for some reason they weren't there, they would wonder at first, perhaps, what's wrong with that picture? I was there. How come I'm not in this photo? But if it happened repeatedly that you were not in the picture, you would start to say, not what's wrong with the picture, but maybe what's wrong with me? Am I invisible? Why am I not included? So just getting in the habit to ask the question, who's missing and what can I do about it, is really what the A, affirming identity, is all about. B, building community, speaks to the fact that in our organizations, we want people to feel like they are a part, that they're part of the community, that we're all rowing in the same direction, that we have a shared commitment to the mission of the organization. In order to do that, every organization has rituals they engage in, whether that's retirement parties or celebration of success or the annual holiday party, something to build community. But that building community doesn't really work very well unless you've been intentional about affirming identity first. You want to be sure that everyone feels included in those activities in order for them really to work. And then the C, cultivating leadership, is really about recognizing that we have people in our organizations, whether those are students in a college or junior executives in a corporation, employees of whatever level, who are trying to develop their leadership skills. They want to advance, they want to be able to engage. In order to advance, they need to be able to engage with people different from themselves because we are living in an increasingly diverse world. If you don't know how to engage effectively with other people, you are, in essence, I like to say, becoming a social dinosaur. You need to be able to have that skill development. And good leaders are creating opportunities where they are making sure there's representation, affirming identity. They're bringing people together, but they're also creating opportunities for folks who may not yet have developed that skill to be able to practice it so that they too will be able to model inclusive leadership.
That is so fascinating. The ABCs: affirming identity, building community, cultivating leadership. Typically, as I recall my own professional career, I can remember being interviewed, and there is a high focus, or there was, on IQ, whether you were smart enough or had the competence to be in a particular role. But it now seems that you not only need IQ, you also need EQ, your emotional intelligence, to make sure that you are inviting people in. Talk a little bit more about things we can do as organizations and individuals to actually move this dial on inclusion, because it seems like when folks are in a room, oftentimes they're frankly self absorbed. And as long as they're comfortable, they're okay. That doesn't mean that we're going to get the project done or be on time, or that everyone will contribute to their highest and best ability. What can we do as individuals and as organizations?
I think the first thing we can do is really coming back to that original question, get in the habit of asking who's missing from the picture. When you
Mhm.
ask that question, you start to notice, are there women in the room? Are there people of color in the room? Are the folks who's maybe LGBTQ, are they represented? Is their perspective represented? Are the people who are um, outside the ordinary suspects that we don't usually include? How are we engaging those folks so that we have a full range of humanity operating in our organization, that we understand whether that's the customer or the student body, whoever it is that we're working with. When you get in the habit of asking who's missing from the picture, you get much better at making sure the picture is more complete. It just becomes a habit of mind. So I like to say that is a good place to start. But it doesn't matter. You don't have to be the leader of the organization to ask that question. You can be someone invited into the room to say, thank you for inviting me, but it looks like some other people are missing. You can also be the person to raise that question, to ask. Certainly, we know that racism persists in our society, sometimes not just because people have deeply held prejudices. Many people don't have deeply held prejudices. They might have been breathing smog, but they may be quite open minded and open hearted and still be perpetuating racist policies and practices because they haven't been looking to see what the impact of those policies and practices has been. Are people having equitable access to resources? Are people being able to take advantage of programs that have been designed to help everyone, but in fact, not everyone is getting full access? I like to use, just as a quick example, the GI Bill. The GI Bill made it possible for a lot of people after World War II to go to school and buy homes. Many people attribute the growth of the American middle class to the GI Bill. But if you look at how it was implemented, most of the benefits went to white veterans. Black veterans were largely shut out of its benefits because colleges and universities were still segregated, and the HBCUs couldn't accommodate all the Black veterans coming home who are looking for education. Loans to buy homes were widely distributed to white veterans, but Black veterans could not get those loans, typically because they were being administered locally, and the same prejudices that had led to segregation kept them from getting access to equitable loans. To give you a scale of that, in New Jersey, northern New York, northern New Jersey, and the New York area, 67,000 loans went to returning veterans. Of those, less than 100 went to Black veterans. In Mississippi, a survey of 16 cities, 3,200 loans for veterans, less than 10, only two to Black veterans during this time period of the just after World War II. So when we look at policies and practices, we have to get in the habit of asking who's benefiting, who's not, what can we do about it?
This is all fascinating. And as a daughter of a veteran, my father is now deceased, but I can remember him talking about the GI Bill, but I never knew the statistics around it. So perhaps not only our experiences, but our exposures and experts like yourself can help us measure the impact of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So when we come back to this notion of systemic racism and people's exposure to other cultures and races and ethnicities that they're not familiar with, how do we start having a conversation? Or is that a good method to open up this notion of how we can eliminate or mitigate the damage that we've done to ourselves? In fact, you talked a little bit about this in your book. Can you expand on that?
Sure. One of the things that I like to reference when asked this question is actually a book written by the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. His very last book was published in 1968. The title of it, I think, has a lot of resonance for right now. The title of his book was Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And it seems to me, right at this moment in 2020, we are being asked to choose between chaos or community. But when he wrote that book, one of the things he said was, you can change laws, but in order to really make an impact on the effects of systemic racism, what we need to do is close what I have referenced as the empathy gap, right? People really need to have empathy for somebody else's situation. White people really need to have empathy for the situation of African Americans who are being left behind, or Latinxes, or all of the groups, Indigenous folks, Asian Americans. But when we think about empathy, how do we get empathy? You get empathy by hearing somebody else's story, by listening to them, by understanding their experience, and that can happen through dialogue. One of the most hopeful things that is happening in communities around the country, and particularly on college and university campuses, are this emphasis, the impetus of the introduction, I guess is what I'm trying to say, the introduction of dialogue programs that bring people of different backgrounds together so that they can spend in a very focused and structured way time together talking about issues like racism or other isms and how they are being directly impacted, listening carefully, and coming to deepen one's understanding. Sometimes when I talk about this, people will say, well, talk is cheap, but actually it's not so cheap. It's hard to bring people together to deeply listen. People talk sometimes past each other, but to deeply
Right.
listen and learn from somebody else's experience requires an investment of time and effort. But what happens when you do that typically is that you start to care about that other person. You start to recognize your shared humanity. And when you start to care about another person, you start to take action to support that other person. And that I think is the critical piece. Because it's one thing to know I can recognize a problem, but if I don't care or have a sense of personal investment in solving that problem, I might just turn away and do some other things with my time and energy. If we want people to speak up and to take action to correct the path to interrupt the cycle of racism, what we need to do is be motivated by our connection to their shared humanity. That is what drives people. And so connecting across lines of difference, engaging in dialogue can be very meaningful.
That sounds helpful, and it's hard to believe Dr. King wrote that in 1968, and we're having that same conversation in 2021. And you talk about empathy, and I could not agree with you more. Let me ask you about another emotion, fear. I hear a lot of people who are so afraid to broach the subject of racism or race, or it's just uncomfortable. It's like religion and politics. It was the third rail. You just didn't talk about it. As a little girl, I was taught that fear stood for false evidence appearing real. Uh, and I've kept that with me for a long time, and I share it a lot. What's been your experience as you've talked with individuals, companies, CEOs, students about fear, particularly in walking in this space about race in this year, in 2021?
Yes. Many people are afraid, particularly in this moment when it seems like if you make a wrong move, if you say something wrong, you'll be cancel culture. You'll be on Twitter and people will be talking about you. You can't afford to make a mistake. I think that has heightened people's anxieties. But what is really important to acknowledge is that you can't solve a problem without talking about it. So it becomes important for all of us to exercise some courage and say, yes, I'm going to have this conversation. I'm going to have this dialogue with you because it's important to all of us. One of the things that I often like people to do when I have a chance to bring people together in groups and talk about this is to ask them to reflect on their own earliest race related memory. And what's really striking is it doesn't really matter where you grew up, but most people will have an early memory. Some people will say, well, I don't really have one until I got to high school or college. But most people have a memory that goes back to the time when they were 5 or 6 or 7, early school age. And if you ask them again what emotion is attached to the thing they remember, they'll often say something like confusion, fear, sadness, anger, embarrassment, shame. Of course, sometimes people will say things like happiness. Maybe it had to do with a friendship or something like that. But most people will mention an uncomfortable feeling. And then if you ask, well, given you had this experience, which years later you still remember, years later you can still describe as being upsetting in some way, did you talk to anybody about it at the time that it occurred? What's really interesting is that most people will say they didn't. They didn't share it with a parent. They didn't talk about it with a teacher. And when you ask them why, because the truth of the matter is 5, 6, and 7-year-olds tend to be pretty chatty. So why did you at that age not tell anybody, not talk about it? And usually what people will say is, I don't know, I just knew I wasn't supposed to. I just knew I wasn't supposed to, this was like a taboo topic. The adults around me let me know this was not something to talk about. If we recognize that many of us had that early socialization, that response, if we realize that, what we are pushing against is not just the discomfort of adults, it's also the early learning of children, now adults, right? That's been reinforced by lots of people. And so we have to kind of push back that knot in our stomachs. We have to push past the sweaty palms to just say, you know what, this is important. We have to have this conversation if we're going to move forward as a society. And be willing to give some grace when people make mistakes, because the truth is, we're all vulnerable to making mistakes. But if we don't take that first step, we will find ourselves 20 years from now still in this situation, if not worse, because we have to interrupt the cycle if we want it to stop.
You know, you make such calm and rational points. And I know I find myself in conversations with people getting really emotional, and I have to tell myself, take a step back, take a deep breath. I love your notion of some grace. Number one, have a conversation, but have it with some grace. I remember my mother once telling me, please be candid, but you don't have to be cruel. And I think people would appreciate that. We could have more conversation if more of us would think of that, myself first among equals. Let me ask you this. We've got about 12 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get your answer on this question, because America is a very complex place. There's more here than African Americans or European Americans. There are lots of people, but the notion of race, while a social construct, has really been pronounced between the Black community and the white community. If you had a wish for Black America, understanding you want them to talk more and you want them to get to the crux of this, what would the wish be for Black America? And likewise, what would the wish be for white America so that we can get to a better place?
Well, you know, what's interesting about these two questions is my answer is the same for both. But let me say that, you know, my wish for Black America is the end of racism. You know, when we look at how racism shortens lives, how it limits access for particularly anti-Black racism, limits access to education, to economic opportunity, increases exposure to illness, as we see in this COVID-19 pandemic. There's so many dimensions of racism that negatively impact the life circumstance of African Americans, regardless of their socioeconomic status, right? That every Black American's life is diminished in some way by the continuing perpetuation of racism in our society. But if you ask me what my wish is for white Americans, my answer is the same, because racism is negatively impacting white people as well. That we see the diminishment of our whole nation because of the dysfunction of racism in our society. When we talk about limiting educational access and the impact that has in the African American community, we're also talking about limiting productive contributions to our society that all would benefit from. When we talk about criminal injustice and we talk about for example, longer sentencing of Black people for the same kinds of crimes that white people commit, but longer sentences, those sentences are expensive to administer. That's money being spent on incarceration that's not available for the common good, whether that's improving schools or building roads or whatever else is needed. When we talk about the impact of leaving people out, not having diverse voices at the table, when we talk about that, we are depriving ourselves of better decision making. Research shows over and over again that diverse teams come up with better solutions than homogeneous ones. That when you have diverse teams, companies do better, stock improves, there's all kinds of economic benefits. And we know that having a society where fear is reduced, racism stokes fear. When fear is reduced, people are better able to function. We know that when fairness is in place, when equity is operating, everyone improves their life circumstance and the quality of life improves for all of us. So I think that when we think about my magic wand, is when I think about that, it's the elimination of racism for the benefit of everyone.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. As I think about the framework that you've given us for context, the four P's: population, political change, polarization, and psychology, it is incredibly helpful to give us that point of view that there has been a lot that has happened. There's still a significant amount of work that needs to be done. The actionable steps in your ABCs: affirming identity, building community, and tell me the third one again: cultivating leadership.
Cultivating leadership. Yes, cultivating leadership.
Exactly. And then cross racial dialogue. It seems so straightforward, but to hear you explain it is so incredibly helpful and on point. And most importantly, you've given us a vaccine today for racism. The idea that you would wave your magic wand and eliminate it for Black America and white America. We cannot thank you enough for the work that you have done and the work you continue to do. Thank you for being connected to Operation Hope and all of us who are trying to ensure that everyone reaches their full potential.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been my pleasure and honor to be with you today.